Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. We will discuss a very important novel today that has been called Surreal, Ultra-Real, and From the Heart. It's a harrowing novel of the Iraq invasion and occupation beginning in 2003 and exposes the dark heart of that war for all to see. And that novel is War Porn by Roy Scranton. Nice to have you back on our show.
Glad to be back, Lois.
Great. Roy is the co-editor of Fire and Forget, short stories from the long war. He grew up in Oregon and enlisted in the U.S. Army in 2002 and had a 14-month deployment to Iraq. After leaving the Army in 2006, he earned a bachelor's degree and master's degree at the New School for Social Research and then completed his Ph.D. in English at Princeton University. I agree with the book reviewer who wrote, War Porn is written to give us a new blueprint on how to think about war and to show us that everyone, our citizens, our soldiers, and those we purport to save, are all incredibly affected by the horror of war. As noted inside the book cover, war porn is actually a noun, which means videos, images, and narratives featuring graphic violence, often brought back from the combat zone. So, Roy, what motivated you to write war porn?
I started writing the book in 2005, actually, when I was still in the Army and had been out of Iraq for about a year. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to tell a story about the Iraq War that wasn't the standard conventional narrative that a lot of veterans write now, which is I went to war and war is hell, and now I come back and I'm gonna share my story. It's sort of often a story about trauma and recovery. Mm-hmm. I wanted to put the Iraq War in a bigger context. I wanted to talk about what the war is like for the people who live there, the Iraqis, mm-hmm. and also to put the war into the context of our life back here in America.
Yes. Well, it's a true page turner of this book. Our viewers should know that you are now the assistant professor of English at the University of Notre Dame. Have you received positive book reviews from your students?
I don't actually know if any of my students have read my book. I don't assign my own books.
You don't?
But some of them came. I did a reading on campus, and some of them came to the reading, and they seem to be engaged by it. The students at Notre Dame are great. They're just really smart and engaged, and I couldn't be happier.
Great. Now, briefly tell our viewers and readers the story of your novel, War Porn.
So the novel is basically, it's built, it has a somewhat complicated structure. It's built like Russian nesting dolls. So there's three main narratives, and they're sort of one inside another. Okay. We enter the book through the story of a young woman named Dahlia, who's living in Utah with her boyfriend. And they're having a barbecue on Columbus Day. And they invite some friends over, and one of their friends brings with her a veteran who just came back from Iraq named Aaron. We meet them. There's an argument erupts about the Iraq War and what it means, and an incident happens, and then we shift to the second major narrative, which follows an American soldier named Specialist Wilson through his year in Iraq as a Humvee driver. That section of the book is sort of the lettuce on the sandwich. Is mostly it's much based on my own experience.
Yes, that was my question. Was
right.
Based on your experience?
Yeah. It's drawn from my own experience quite a bit, and it's sort of we follow Wilson in his arc, this arc of basically his increasing callousness and dehumanization over his year in Baghdad, and then we follow him for a while, and then we come to the third major narrative, which is really the core and for me the heart of the book, which is about an Iraqi mathematician named Qasim al-Zabadi, and with each narrative as we go in, we sort of go back in time a little bit. So we go from 2004 to 2003, and then with Qasim we go back to the American invasion.
Yes. And how it really impacted the citizens of Iraq.
Exactly. We see the bombing from his point of view and with his family, and watch how their lives are just torn upside down and torn apart by the invasion.
Yes.
And then we come back out the other side, back through Wilson, where we meet Qasim as an interpreter, and then back to the kids in Utah, where we see Qasim again only this time through photographs of torture, like the Abu Ghraib scandal. And that's where the war porn, one of the meanings of war porn comes back in.
The end of this book was really hard to read, really hard to read. Well, what is the significance of your title, war porn?
Right. So the term, as you mentioned, refers to videos or pictures often sent back or brought back from soldiers, by soldiers from the war of violence or bodies. It also refers to the photos from the Abu Ghraib scandal and the photos of torture. And it also refers, in a broader sense, to the idea of the war story itself, the idea, and in a sort of, in a way that questions, that sort of asks the question of why do we want to read a war story? What do we want from our war stories? Why do we like to look at pictures of violence and death and read these stories? That question is at the heart of my book in a lot of different ways. Some people have said that it's an anti-war novel, and that might be true, but I tend to think of it actually more as an anti-war novel.
It's funny when I asked one of the camera operators, I said, should I put on a neutral tablecloth or a red tablecloth because it's this is about war?
Right.
And he goes, well, what was the theme of the book? Was it violent or was it pro-war or anti-war?
Right.
and I thought, well, it was really more anti-war, and really in your book, I mean, you get the feeling of you're against war.
Well, I mean, of course, war's a terrible thing, but I don't feel like it's any great thing to be against war. That's like being against hurricanes killing a bunch of people, or being against, cancer.
Because
right?
war is always with us.
Yeah, exactly. War is just a fact of human life. But war porn is like I just said, like an anti-war novel. So it's against, it's not against war as much as it is against working to critique and open up the kinds of stories we tell about war.
Aha.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, is there a cultural message about returning and adjusting to life after serving in the military in Iraq in your book?
In my book, I think the novel is pretty pessimistic about that transition. And
it is.
Yeah, and sees that transition as a point of danger and in kind of infection. I think there's a way in which Aaron, the veteran in the Utah sections, he was infected, I think, by the evil he was a part of, and he brings that back to America with him. And I feel like that's representative in a certain way of what happened with the Iraq War.
Does that mean that our VA hospitals should be doing a lot more in counseling and psychiatric help and?
Yes, but there's more to it than that. The problem isn't so much a psychological issue or even a psychiatric issue, although that's part of it. The problem is deeper in how we understand why America goes to war and what purpose that serves and what role our soldiers have in relation to the American body politic and in relation to the violence that our government asks them to commit overseas.
That's so true. That is so true. Well, how is a novel about serving in Iraq different from writing one about serving in World War II?
Well, so there are many differences. Simple historic differences. There's the fact that the Iraq War is a much smaller conflict than World War II and has many fewer people involved. The Iraq War is fought by a volunteer army, not a draft army, and of course the sort of part of the difference is that we read, novelists today read the war literature from World War II. We read Norman Mailer and James Jones, and that work has come down to us as part of what we work against as writers. So those are some differences, and of course.
But it seems like the American public was so much more behind the military in terms of we're behind our soldiers, but again, there was a whole movement of people that would come back from Iraq and they're considered heroes. They're welcomed with open arms. It's still they're viewed very favorably, I think. people that serve.
If you look at the response to Clint Eastwood's film version of American Sniper, you can see that a lot of people are very much interested in worshiping the heroes that come back from Iraq, worshiping the killers who killed Iraqis like Chris Kyle, and as well, World War II is actually much more complicated than we tend to think of it now. I could talk about that at some length, but it's worth just saying that wars always look better in the distant hindsight than they do at the time.
Yes. Well, what is the challenge of telling war stories to people who have never been downrange? I mean, what is the challenge to telling?
I think the biggest challenge in telling war stories to people who haven't ever been in a conflict zone is that they think it's a special place. People who haven't been to a combat zone think of it as a kind of glamorous, special, magical place, and the sort of disturbing and enlightening thing about war is that it's not. It's just like this. It's just this life, only much more dangerous, stupider,
but it's a job.
Dirtier,
it's a job.
And it's a job.
Yes.
It's a job just like any other job.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you: have you ever been in a prison detention center when you served in Iraq? I mean, this prisoner detention center is, of course, very emphasized in your book, and was it as gruesome as you wrote about in your novel?
So I never served as a military police, and I never worked in a prison. We did detain Iraqis. Some of them may have been guilty of things. Some of them were definitely not, and delivered them to detention facilities. We did that, and so I saw a little bit of how they were treated from the outside.
From the outside,
but nothing really from the inside. What's in war porn and the kinds of the photos that Aaron shows and the experience that he talks about, that's based on the Abu Ghraib situation and the Taguba report and the many documents talking about primary documents and other kinds of documents talking about what happened, the torture that Americans inflicted on Iraqis and Afghans.
Well, let's talk about that. What kind of torture? I mean, let's be graphic about it. What did they do?
Waterboarding, forcing people to stand for hours, having sexual humiliation, forcing Iraqis to take their clothes off and humiliating them, dumping them, keeping them on ice water, forcing them into extreme physical positions.
And not allowing they can't sleep. They're always...
Yeah. Chaining them to a jail bars and leaving them there for days or hours and days. Physical abuse, striking, punching, kicking. I mean, a lot of things, slamming them into walls. My friend Eric Fair wrote a book called Consequence, which he worked as a contract interrogator in Abu Ghraib, and he talks at some length about some of the things that he had to do, that he did when he was working as an interrogator there, and it's gruesome. And
I don't think Americans really realize how terrible it is. I think that your book really, they should read it just to see what happens. I mean,
I think a lot of Americans I think we knew for a moment, and then a lot of people chose to ignore it and forget it.
Forget it. That's it. You did not witness any of the atrocities used against the prisoners, but you heard about it and you read about it and so you know about it.
Yeah, it's documented.
Yeah,
it's carefully documented by government, by the U.S. government, and by witnesses.
Right. Now, when you served in Iraq, I know you've always been interested in writing. Did you have a notebook where you kept notes and
no, I didn't.
You're just too busy doing your job, right?
I was too busy doing my job. It was very vivid, and it stayed with me. The experience stayed with me for quite a while, and still comes back at times. But no, I wasn't especially taking notes. I thought while I was there that I might I would probably write about it. But
Yeah. Well, let me ask you. In your novel, there are a lot of ways to relieve tensions with girls of the night. I mean, can you describe the availability of free and paid love?
So in the novel, that's mentioned. There's a section where it's mentioned in Abu Ghraib, in the Abu Ghraib section, and again, that's from the sort of from research and documents. And my experience in Iraq is that we were actually rather segregated from the Iraqi communities. There were rumors about things. The other thing the novel touches on is prostitutes in Germany, which are American soldiers there commonly availed themselves of that opportunity.
Okay, so
yeah.
But
that's legal in Germany,
yes,
and
yes.
I mean it's still tied up in human trafficking, and
Right.
and it's morally, it's an ethical and moral problem in all kinds of ways, but it's at least legal and
Yeah. Well, then of course, of course, there's terrible boredom sometimes in being a soldier, and you describe the scenes where soldiers are using spiders to fight scorpions at the camp. I mean, I found it interesting to read that whatever insect won, it was called Saddam.
Right. It's a little joke, but the bug fights were real.
They're big bugs in Iraq, right?
Yeah, camel spiders. They can grow
Wow.
to be like this big even.
Big
Most
spider.
of them were about this big, and then you have scorpions that are about the same size.
And they're just scuttling around the base, right?
Oh yeah. It's terrifying to like have one of those come at you. There was one came at me and I stomped on it, and then like I stepped back and then it came at me again.
Oh really?
They're hardy creatures. But the funny thing is, and I talk about this in the book, is that the camel spiders actually weren't very aggressive with the scorpions, and they weren't able to sort of get through the scorpion's exoskeleton. And so any fight between a camel spider and a scorpion, the scorpion would just take it out.
No, take it out. Okay.
Yeah, no question.
Well, the other thing, there was a lot of locker room talk about the female soldiers in your novel.
Yeah.
Would you care to comment about that?
That was the culture that of the military that I saw, and that I was a part of.
F-word is used a lot.
Yeah, the F-word's used a lot. All kinds of words are used a lot. So I was in an all-male unit. I was in the field artillery. It was before women were allowed into combat roles.
Okay.
It was mostly young men, and it was a very, very ripe environment. A lot of dirty language and a lot of objectification of women. Sometimes watching porn together and talking about sort of, it's a funny way that it's a funny thing that I've seen men do, and some people have talked about this. Men will bond socially by objectifying and degrading women together. They're like, we're not that. We're men together. This is how we're men, is by degrading a woman. I mean, it's the exact same thing we saw with Trump and Billy Bush. Is they're bonding right over degrading women together.
Yeah. Ooh.
It's a common social phenomenon. It's really terrible.
Yeah. I also found it interesting that your character, Matt, in the novel says, well, should we stay? Do we have a moral imperative to clean up our mess, to bring democracy to the Middle East? I mean, why can't we just leave? And, I mean, what did the U.S. soldier on the ground want national leaders to do regarding exiting this war? I mean, what did they want?
What did they want? I think most of the soldiers wanted to do their job and go home.
They didn't think about the future. That was the military's problem. Right? That was the generals and the politicians to take care of, right?
Yeah, I think there's at least two things going on in the mind of most enlisted soldiers. One is that it's their job and they're doing their job, and they're concerned about getting to the end of their day, getting home, getting back to their family, and they're concerned about the men and women that they serve with. The other thing that's going on in a lot of soldiers' minds is the kind of the ideological justification for what they're doing, and that tends to be more along the lines of a kind of patriotism and what America first, and whatever we do is right, and we should do the thing that is best for a strong America.
Right.
And those two things are often not quite in line with the directives and the messages that are coming down from above, whether from the political level or from our higher command.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that most of the U.S. soldiers in your book have been educated to believe that if the Iraqis are not killed, they will be coming over to get Americans in the United States. I mean, let's switch back to that time in the military. Did you believe in those statements about your mission in Iraq? Did you think that you were going to be, if you didn't get them here, they'd be coming over to get us in America?
I think that was a line that was put out by the command, and they were taking that from
like propaganda
from the political leadership. Yeah. I mean, that was basically the line of the Bush administration. At a certain level, they worked to make connections between Iraq and Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, and to connect the idea of Iraq in Americans' mind with 9/11, basically implying that if we don't invade Iraq and take care of these weapons of mass destruction, right, the smoking gun will be a mushroom cloud, right?
Right.
And so that was the government line. Very few soldiers, from my understanding, from what I saw, very few soldiers, American soldiers in Iraq, actually believed that was the case.
Okay, interesting. Well, you know, your language paints the picture in Iraq so well. I mean, little Iraqi kids were running at the American Humvees waving knives, and they're yelling, "America, you can buy Pepsi, you can buy a bayonet," and yet some of these children might have been run over. I mean, they're really harsh in dealing with like the children that are trying to sell things to the GIs, right? I mean.
Yeah, it was a very chaotic environment that we drove into in Iraq. We arrived just after the invasion, and this is my experience there driving into Iraq is sort of what these sections are based on. And the Iraqis were enthusiastic about trying to. The Iraqis we saw anyway were enthusiastic about trying to make friends with us, trying to sell us Pepsi or souvenirs, right? That's what the knives were. They're bayonets, they're Iraqi military bayonets they were trying to sell us.
Right.
But we were totally freaked out. Our command was freaked out, and we were terrified about snipers and IEDs and suicide bombers, and so we regarded everyone, children, grown-ups, whatever, as a potential enemy to be.
So what you were yelling at them, stop and halt and don't come any closer. And of course the children probably thought you were just teasing them, right?
Yeah, often.
And do you think you ever ran over any children? I mean, do you?
I didn't run over any children.
Good.
I ran some cars off the road on convoy. That was part of my job. Was
to avoid the children, right?
No, not children specifically. When we were driving our convoy through heavy traffic in Baghdad, sometimes we'd have to push cars off the road to keep the convoy going.
And man, I love your descriptive language in your novel. You write about the Iraqi countryside. There's no running water, there's no electricity, no AC, no grass, no windows, no fans. Everyone wears camouflage and talks gobbledygook and stares. I mean, it was a really kind of tough to be there, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, and so that description, that section is from the point of view of Wilson, from the American soldier just after arriving and being sent out on this guard mission in this sort of, empty zone just outside of Baghdad. And it's from a particular perspective, right? One of the things that was really important to me for this book was to have different views of Iraq, right? Wilson is just outside of Baghdad, which is a fully modern city of 6 million people, but all he sees, right, is that there's ruins and there's no running water and there's no toilets, but that's just where he is and that's his point of view. That's why the Qasim section in the center of the book was so important to me.
I love that section because you really cover it as from the point of view of the Iraqi family, and it is just dreadful what's happened to them. And they're cultured and they're educated,
right?
And they could fit into American society without any problem. I mean, they're very civilized.
Right.
And they're treated like rats. I mean, it's shocking, really.
Well, that's what happened.
And they're
that's
in hell.
What we did
they're
to that
in hell,
country.
Because of And the other thing is, I couldn't get over was the fact that all these roaming gangs of, it was like the mafia. If you didn't pay off certain Iraqis to protect you, they'd cut off your finger, they'd kidnap your children.
There was a power vacuum.
Yeah.
And what came into that vacuum were local criminals and gangsters and people with guns and religious leaders like Muqtada al-Sadr and terrorists like al-Zarqawi. And that's who became powerful in that environment.
Well, let me ask you, what's happening in Iraq now? What about ISIS? What about the future here? What's going to happen next, do you think?
I think it's a tragedy. It's more than a tragedy. It's horrific what's happening to Iraq right now.
We have troops there now, right?
We have about 6,000 troops there, mainly supporting the Iraqi army's fight against ISIS or ISIL or Daesh to take back Mosul right now. Probably by the time this airs, that battle will be ongoing. The battle for Mosul, and it's all fallout from our invasion and war, and not just that, but also, 20 plus years of intensive military intervention in Iraq. We can go back to the Persian Gulf War, where we bombed the stuffing out of the country the first time, and then kept bombing it off and on for years, and had an embargo and had sanctions, and the country's really been put through the ringer again and again and again.
And there's no end in sight, is there?
There's not really.
There's like you said, there's a power vacuum, and there's really evil people have filled the positions, right?
Yeah, and a lot of analysts are worried about what happens after Mosul, because that will actually open up divisions between the Shia militias and the Sunni militias and the Kurds and one Kurdish faction and another Kurdish faction and the Turks and all the people who have been uniting to fight ISIS in Iraq will now have to decide amongst themselves how to divide power, and there's a strong likelihood that will devolve into further conflicts.
So, Roy, you're not optimistic about the future of Iraq,
I'm
right?
deeply pessimistic about the future of that country, which is awful, because the Iraqis I've met, I went back to Iraq in 2014 for Rolling Stone and talked
for
to
Rolling Stone. How cool.
Yeah, talked to a lot of Iraqis there, met a lot of great people, and a lot of them they're people, but a lot of them are wonderful people, and the suffering there is
terrible.
Tremendous.
Well, where can our viewers, I have to start to end this great discussion, where can our viewers in Arlington find your book?
They can find my book at Kramer Books in D.C. or your local bookstore, or also on the Soho Press website. They can find it there. They can also find it through my website, royscranton.com.
Your name, Roy Scranton.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roy, so much for being
Lois,
here again.
having
We
me on.
love having you. Thank you for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.